1999's Tangerine Bear, Home in Time for Christmas, is both a mouthful of a title for a film and a heartfelt and charming little Christmas movie that, while simple in its plotting, left a solid impression on me with the message it was trying to put out there. This film was actually very graciously sent to me by friend of the show and world's most Midwestern hot dish sampler, Triv of Trivial Theatre. She apparently found it in a second-hand store while on her travels and picked it up thinking like it looked like my kind of rodeo. And given the subject and nature of this film, I think that's probably just about the most perfect way I could have come into possession of this movie. And I'm now morally obliged to hang on to it until either it succumbs to disc rot or I do. This film was originally based on a children's storybook simply titled Tangerine Bear, which was released in 1997 by Betty and Michael Paraskevas. They were approached to adapt their storybook into an animated film, and it's clear to me that keeping the original authors close to this project was the key to ensuring its success. Because this film has a lot of heart and a very strong message and voice at its core that I feel would have become lost had it been leased out and adapted by just some random scriptwriter. That isn't to say that this film's perfect, but I feel it's all the better for getting the original authors on board. The film opens at a bear-making factory, and it's nearly Christmas, and due to the increase in demand for teddy bears, the factory's now running considerably longer hours and a lot of staff members are working overtime in order to meet the large number of orders coming in ahead of the holidays. Unfortunately, one of the staff members on duty that night finds himself in a literal game of cat and mouse with a cheeky rodent who's trying to nibble his lunch. The mouse manages to escape capture, but accidentally knocks a bear over on the production line right as it's about to go into the machine that stitches its award-winning smile on. As a result, this bear's smile gets stitched on upside down, leaving him looking rather melancholic. The guy on shift is so bothered that he didn't catch the mouse and that his lunch has been ruined that he totally misses our frowny bear going into a shipment destined for Kroll's department store. And it's here that we're more formally introduced to Bear, as, while chilling in the back of the shipment truck heading for Kroll's, all of the bears jump out of their boxes and begin to happily dance around and sing at the prospect of being picked up by a loving family and treated to a lifetime of cuddles, affection and care. With one of the bears assuming a leading role, he helps to rouse all the other bears with a "gotta get sold" mantra. Anyway, after these shenanigans, we arrive at Kroll's and it's pretty chaotic. One by one, the bears go flying off the shelf to be wrapped and nestled under the tree. All of them except for our bear, who remains, sadly, on the shelf. He's not disheartened though, he knows his time will come, but eventually he's the only one left on the shelf. And once the holiday season comes and goes, he's unfortunately relegated to the discount table. There, however, he meets Louie and Dolly. Louie is a monkey who has somehow ended up completely coloured blue, while Dolly is similar to Bear in the sense that she just missed out of being chosen during the Christmas run, and as a result wound up on the discount table to make space for the New Year lines. Bear's confused as to how he got on the discount table, so Louie shows him that his smile is in fact a frown. Bear is even more disheartened at this revelation, but continues to remain confident he'll find the right person who'll pick him because he's smiling on the inside, resolving that the right person will see that quality in him. A couple of days pass without a sale, and eventually Louie and Dolly both end up being picked from the discount table, leaving Bear all alone. This won't be for long, however, as he's swiftly nabbed and thrown in a trunk and leaves Kroll's. When the trunk opens up, he's in a new place. This is Winkle's Emporium, a place for defective and second-hand goods. Mr. Winkle buys up the area's discount stock, sorts through it, and keeps the stuff he feels he can either sell or repair. And he's decided to keep Bear, a teapot without a lid, and an umbrella without a handle from the recent haul. Bear is given pride of place in the window of Winkle's, where he's introduced to some new friends. There's Jack, a jack-in-the-box whose bells don't jingle and who's terrified of going back in his own box. A cuckoo clock bird whose beak got damaged when he sprung out of his house and hit something, leaving him to always ask if the coast is clear before popping out. And Lorelei, a mermaid with a clock in her stomach whose only crime was going out of fashion. The store's also guarded by a bulldog named Virgil, who pretty much hates his security gig. He hates the toys because they get in the way and cause trouble, and really, he just wants the shop to close permanently so that he can have more time with Mr. Winkle. The toys almost immediately take a liking to Bear, who's still confident this is only going to be a brief stay. But the toys have the rather unfortunate duty of telling Bear that this won't be the case. Because, you see, the street that Winkle's Emporium sits on used to be one of the busiest, most commercial streets in the entire city. But fairly recently, a huge bridge was built linking the city to a neighbouring town that has a mega mall. As such, as soon as the bridge opened, 90% of the business went there, leaving Winkle's as a forgotten relic that gets very light foot traffic these days. There's even some talk of Mr. Winkle having trouble making ends meet, which could mean the store's closure very soon. But Bear isn't too let down by this information. In fact, he sees it as a bit of a challenge to try and find his forever family in the face of near impossible odds. And after a particularly Tom and Jerry-esque encounter with Virgil, he manages to secure a really nice chair to sit on in the shop window. What he doesn't realise is just quite how long he's going to be sat there, as after a few months without a taker, the gang notice that Bear has become partly sun damaged, and that the entirety of his front has turned a bright tangerine colour. His fur on the back has stayed the same, but it's also starting to wear a little due to the seat he's been sitting on not having a cushion. Still undefeated, he simply spends the hours that Winkle is out of sight tanning his back half to match the front, eventually fully becoming the Tangerine Bear. This seemingly doesn't do much to help his sales chances, however, and when a passerby ends up picking up Lorelei because he likes the whole retro aesthetic, the gang start to feel a bit low that not only have they lost a friend, but that they may wind up trapped in the store forever. In a near 50-minute heartstring puller for the ages, will the Tangerine Bear find his family? Will Virgil ever learn to love the toys? And will Winkle's Emporium manage to make ends meet long enough for the toys to escape landfill? Well, all this and more will be answered if you check out Tangerine Bear: Home in Time for Christmas. And imperfectly perfect seems to be the theme that runs through this production from tail to snout, quite honestly. Because, make no mistake, this is a film with flaws, but its positives shine so brightly and unashamedly that it almost makes me feel bad to pick on the one or two things that did bug me about this and which ultimately stopped me from truly loving this film. To get the film's biggest praise out of the way up front, the script is simply delightful. Exactly what you want in a weepy but in a good way Christmas special. The key message of finding your place and family in the world via unconventional means is played with such sincerity, it's almost guaranteed to melt even the coldest of hearts this Christmas. At 48 minutes long, the pacing is near enough perfect. It's one of those films that I feel could, in theory, be shorter without much lost, but here, the script breathes comfortably for the most part and only really begins to sag a little in the back end of the second act. The characters are all utterly innocent, kind and lovable, with even Virgil, the mean bulldog, getting a good softening that feels earned across the runtime. The dialogue's fine to good, if not a little basic, but if you remember that this film's TA is small children aged between 3 and 6, I feel like it kind of gets a bit of a free pass for not exactly being Chaucer. All in all, it's a simple but effective story with well-written characters that will almost certainly be a comfort blanket to kids who feel like they don't belong or are looking to find an identity, and especially kids who have fractious families. This film says, don't worry about it, you'll find where you belong in time. And I'm totally okay with that messaging. That isn't to say, however, that the scripting is faultless. Being adapted from a kid's storybook and being an early adaptation from the authors, it does have some issues. Probably the biggest one for me is that it does feel a little bit like this was a solid 35 to 45 minutes long, but because the film would be more likely to get a TV distribution if it were closer to 40 to 50 minutes, because you can put 2 to 3 commercials in there, it does feel like some scenes were padded out a bit beyond their comfortable end point. The opening act showing how Bear got his frown is fine, but overplayed, which does upset the flow of things a bit. In fact, the majority of the first act seems to have had that problem. But I think that's mainly due to the source material the authors were adapting from. You see, the Tangerine Bear was only 32 pages long, and as you can probably imagine, books and film are totally different mediums, and what flows in books might not necessarily one-to-one when it comes to making the jump to film. I feel like because the book was so short here, they felt the need to pull every single facet of the book into the movie, which doesn't necessarily help the film's pacing or flow. The discount table scene is probably the best example of this. In the book it probably occupied a brief handful of pages, but in the film it's a full 5 to 10 minutes of the runtime, and it's just odd. Because this is the first act. The act where you usually set up your characters, introduce the people you're going to be hanging around with for most of the movie, and set the expectations of the picture. We're introduced to Louie and Dolly here, and in the book, that was likely a brief exchange just to introduce Bear to the concept of damaged toys, and to set up that he's a damaged toy himself. But in this version, they go to great lengths setting up Louie and Dolly. Bear has a musical number, we get to know these characters, and then they're sold off and they never turn up again. Which threw me, because I was wondering why the film spent so much time setting up Louie and Dolly if they literally don't have any other function for the rest of the movie. It would have made more sense to have Bear not get sold at Kroll's and then wind up in the trunk on the way to Winkle's because he entered stock clearance, rather than going on a reduced table for a bit, then going to clearance, then going to Winkle's. Had they just gone straight to Winkle's, it would have given more weight to Bird, Jack and Lorelei, because they'd have been the folks to introduce Bear to the idea of damaged goods. They'd have been there to comfort him and really build a stronger base that would have paid back tenfold for scenes like when Lorelei is sold, and the darker moments for the toys in the third act. I also feel like the need to pad the runtime and the lack of source material means that some scenes tend to repeat with slight variation. I don't mind the toys having to perform an action once or twice with slight variance to show character progression, but there are multiple instances of this in the back half of the second act and the opening of the third act, which I thought was a bit of a shame, as it really slowed things down more than they needed to be. I also had some issues around the pacing of the musical numbers. There's a good 2 to 4 of them in the first act and a good 2 to 4 of them in the third, but there's this mysterious gulf in the second act where they go all in on plot over singing. And it's just long enough to make you wonder if they put the musical numbers in the opening to try and trick people into thinking it was a musical, but then they smash back into musical numbers. I don't know, it just feels like the second act needed a song or two to just help keep things a bit more consistent in terms of the pacing and act structuring. It means ultimately that while this film's tone, characters, vibes and act structuring are pretty rock solid, that opening act really takes a long time to find its thread and comes across as a bit disjointed and generic Christmas special-y as a result. Once it does find its thread, it's pretty much fine, but I'm just not entirely sure how many kids today would be willing to give this film 10 to 15 minutes to find that rhythm before giving up and trying something else. As mentioned, the script was adapted from a novel by Betty and Michael Paraskevas. They have 4 credits to their name at the time of recording, and their best known piece is probably being that they adapted and consulted on the entirety of Maggie and the Ferocious Beast, a TV series that itself was adapted from their work. I feel Maggie was a more successful jump from page to screen than this, but I feel like this film has more heart, truthfully. The last credit was in 2007. The film was directed by Burt Ring. He's probably best known for his work in the art department, with 36 credits under his belt. But he isn't a stranger to directing either, with 19 credits to his name, with big hitters including Hey Arnold, Life with Louie and a few episodes of Family Guy. His last directing credit was for the series Ready Jet Go in 2016. And on the direction of the animation, it's a bit of a mixed bag, truthfully. I think the vision Ring had for its adaptation is spot on. He really makes you feel for these characters and its world. The issue I have really with it lies less in the creative vision of the adaptation and more in the creative vision behind the art styles. Because for some reason, this film mixes and matches 2 to 3 different art styles, and they don't really mix very well in my opinion. I personally like the more minimalist art style for this kind of production, so the look and feel of Bear and Mr. Winkle are pretty spot on for me. They have distinctive features, but the approach has been less, not more. Then there are characters like Jack and Bird, who are a little bit more detailed, they have more distinct facial features and their designs are a little more complex. I'm okay with these, as I think that they can kind of blend in with the minimalist characters without standing out too much. But then there's a third art style, and this is where the film kinda loses me a bit. because these characters are seemingly designed based on the old Nintendo Philips CDI art style, and they're overly detailed compared to the other characters, way too stylized, and for me at least, they jar massively against the other characters. They just feel really out of place, and while mercifully they only turn up a handful of times across the runtime, when they do turn up, I really got pulled out of the story because I was so put off by the character designs. I'm not entirely sure why they chose to do this the way they did, but it almost feels like they split the film into layered chunks and gave multiple animation studios a handful of characters and set designs to work on with no brief, and then they just tried to slam it all together. It's distracting, which is a real shame given that, like I say, the tone of the script seems to be really well executed in how the art design and creative vision and how the film will look has been translated. I just wish there'd been more consistency. In terms of cinematic assembly, the edit's fine enough, cuts are pretty precise, there's a pretty decent attention to detail on making sure to cut away to try and keep up the pace. It almost certainly needed one more pass through to really properly nail that runtime down, but I've got no complaints. It did the job it was supposed to do about as well as it could have done. It'll probably surprise you to find out that the cast for this film is actually pretty mind-blowing given the budget and scope of the brief. But on hand for this feature, we have the likes of Tom Bosley, Howie Mandel, Jenna Elfman, David Hyde Pierce, Jonathan Taylor Thomas, Marlon Wayans, Trisha Yarwood, David L. Lander, and John Polito. And they're all pretty good, like, really pretty good. Again, considering that this wasn't a big budget release, they all give really solid performances. They land the tone, warmth and humour that this film needed, and I think they're really the saving grace of the picture, as with a lesser invested cast, this could have become painfully generic very quickly. Instead, they bring a real animation to proceedings, they fully embrace their characters and they match the visuals beat for beat. I think they're quite wonderful here, and they pretty much make the film worth checking out on that facet alone. And finally, the soundtrack. And it's a bit of a shame, honestly, because we have some very generic incidental MIDI Christmas sounding music as the backdrop for this thing, and while some of the musical numbers are enjoyable and fun, there are more than a couple that just rang really hollow and came across as a little forced. The opening title music being a great example of that kind of 90s American ballad that doesn't really say or mean anything type fodder. It's basically there to just set the mood, which is fine, but it doesn't really do anything for the production other than glaringly blare, "This is a heartwarming Christmas film, get the kids in." Like, it would have been nice to have something a bit more distinct and unique to this film, to really help sell the overhanging themes of wanting to belong. It's an aspect of the production where I feel they really kind of fell a little short. Tangerine Bear Home in Time for Christmas was released on VHS in 1999 and DVD in 2000 over in the US. In the UK, it didn't get a release until November 2002, when it solely came out on DVD by Universal and Right Entertainment. They then repackaged and re-released the film on DVD again in 2004. Prior to this, the film had had a few airings on UK television in 2001 and 2003 respectively, so I assume that was a bit of a dry run for this release. Given my copy came from the States, I don't know what, if any, extras were included on the UK version, but what I can say is that the US version is one of those discs that opens with the movie first, then at the end of the film it cuts to a main menu. There's some pretty solid extras on the set, including an interview with the authors, a making-of featurette, a trivia game about the film, trailers and more. The picture quality is relatively sharp, the audio's pretty much fine. I'd quite like to see this one get the proper HD treatment at some point, but I know it'll only ever likely get an upscale release, if it gets one at all. Much like the film's main messaging, despite its flaws, I saw a lot of good in Tangerine Bear. Its gentle but powerful messaging approach really won me over, and that combined with some fantastic voice performances, an overall reasonably paced production, and some nice musical numbers, ultimately carried the film over the line. If you come to this channel solely for sci-fi crazy trouser explosions, your mileage may significantly vary, but the film's readily available if you know where to look, and I do genuinely recommend you check this one out this holiday season.